Hola, muy buenas tardes. Soy Dumashi Amable y este programa es Desahogamiento. Bienvenido a al tercero parte de la mezcla gente. Today we're going to talk about community, legacy, and the mixed experience. Um, so, la mezcla gente, the people of the mix. We've been talking about this for 2 weeks now. This is our third week. And we aren't just talking about the check boxes on a census form. We're talking about the soul of our community, especialmente en los Estados Unidos, pero hay mucha mezcla gente en el Caribe. As we look forward to my graduation this May and my transition into clinical work, I've been thinking deeply about how we, as neighbors, vecinos, tíos y tías y amigos, can better nurture the mixed marriages and the mixed progeny who often feel like they belong everywhere and nowhere a la misma tiempo. So last week I got to interview with Carla Santiago. I had such a great time, muy divertido. Carla es muy amable. Su trabajo es muy importante en nuestra comunidad. Y nos hablamos de los dreamers and the newest generation en los Estados Unidos. So to understand where we're going, we have to look at who is leading the way. The term dreamer has become a pillar of our modern identity, specifically referring to those eligible for DACA, also known as Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals programs. I have some friends who came to the United States and they walked here into this country and landed in all different parts of our nation. Okay, nos leemos the numbers, los números. As of 2026, there are approximately 530,000 active DACA recipients. But the broader dreamer population, meaning those who arrived as children but lack a permanent status en los Estados Unidos, is estimated at nearly 2 million people en los Estados Unidos. Think about that. 2 million people, 2 million of our friends and neighbors came into the United States as children and have been living here for years, decades. You know, más de 20 años de la vida. So there's a new guard. We are seeing a massive shift in the age range of the newest first generation US born Latinos. The dreamer generation is getting married and having kids. Currently, the median age for Latinos in the US is only 30 years old. Solamente 30 años. Este es el tiempo en una vida que tenemos hijos. And the sort of normal age for non-Latinos in the United States is median age is 42. There is a school age surge right now. So kiddos, los niños en la escuela. Roughly 29% of the Latino population is under the age of 18. This generation alpha of Latinos is almost entirely US born, often growing up in households where la mezcla isn't just a concept, it's the breakfast table reality. So let's talk a little bit more about the Caribbean, which is our close friend here in the United States, and they share an even stronger picture of Latin culture. So we're talking about the deep roots and the genetic history of the Caribbean. Our mezcla isn't new. It is centuries old. Forged on the islands of the Greater Antilles, the history of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic is a story of mestizaje, the blending of European, predominantly Spanish de España, Africa, and the indigenous lineages, los taínos. So, nos vemos el data por Puerto Rico. The average genetic heritage profile in Puerto Rico is 64% European, so mostly from Spain, 21% African, and only 15% Taino. The historical context, we have the Gracias al Sacar laws, which allowed mixed race people to purchase white status, favoring blending over segregation. So this is an interesting history for Puerto Rico. I know Puerto Rico has been in the news quite a bit, especially with Bad Bunny at the Super Bowl this year. And we had some really popular and sort of unpopular commentary on the news and on the socials for sure. We had people saying, "Oh, Puerto Rico's a different country," and then there was other people that were like, "No, not so fast. No es la verdad. Puerto Rico es una parte de los Estados Unidos. Y en el lugar de mi nacimiento en Massachusetts hay mucha gente. Casi todos de mis vecinos son de Puerto Rico en Massachusetts." Sí, so eso es la verdad. Puerto Rico es la misma de los Estados Unidos. Es la verdad. So then we have the Dominican Republic, which the Dominican Republic is regarded as highly triracial. So los tres. Over 40% of the early Spanish settlers married Taino women, which is interesting. It's very different. Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic are neighbors, but they have a very different genetic makeup. So more into the Dominican Republic, they consider themselves more of a Moreno identity, where the mix happened so early in their time in la historia de la país that it actually became the national baseline. And then we have Cuba. Cuba has significant Spanish and Canary Island influence. Now, the Canary Islands are technically part of Spain, but island culture translates a little bit differently in Cuba. So the Canary Island influence mixed with the West African of the Yoruba and Lukumi roots. So 3 islands, all neighbors. La mezcla gente es la realidad de los 3 países, pero es diferente en cada isla. And then just a last note about Cuba. There were later waves of European immigration in the early 1900s. And then this maintained a higher European marker alongside the strong Afro-Cuban traditions. So let's dive into Cuba a little bit more. There's a changing tide of Cuban immigration right now. I know growing up in New England, specifically Massachusetts, and having muchos de mis vecinos de Puerto Rico, que me diga, the roots in Cuba are old, but we've seen this interesting intersection with Cuba and the United States based on some different political boundaries. So the roots are old, but the branches are still moving on the tree of Cuba. The Cuban immigration has transformed over the last decade. And while we talk about the transformation of Cuban immigration and immigration in general, if you're from Puerto Rico, you don't have to immigrate here, right? It's the same country. But if you're from Cuba or you're from the Dominican or you're from Mexico or Venezuela or Peru or Ecuador or Argentina, necesitas una abogada. Y tenemos una amiga, se llama Carla Santiago, y tengo un mensaje con Carla. Protege a los tuyos. La abogada Carla Santiago te ayuda con ajustes de estatus, visas y leyes de la familia. En Santiago Legal tenemos el conocimiento necesario para reunir a tu familia y defender tus derechos. Haz tu cita hoy a las 612-810-7403. Y después tengo un otro mensaje. Tenemos Carlos Sánchez en nuestra ciudad este jueves. Es el 7 de mayo. The comedy show for Carlos Sanchez is a las 7 de la noche at Laugh Camp Comedy Club. So come enjoy yourself this Thursday, have a laugh. Let's be a part of the community and support Carlos Sanchez at Laugh Camp este 7 de mayo a las 7 de la noche. Okay, devuelvo a mi tópica. Okay, so back to Cuban immigration. The Cuban immigration has transformed over the last decade specifically. I know in maybe the late 90s, early 2000s, I remember Elian Gonzalez. He came over from Cuba We saw on the news almost every week, cada semana, hay personas en los barcos and they're traveling. Hay un viaje de Cuba hasta Florida y cada semana it was in the news. So they had this other situation in a different political administration called the wet foot, dry foot policy. This ended in 2017. And since then, we've seen a shift from the maritime arrivals, so coastal arrivals on, the boats, and then to more overland journeys through Central America and Mexico. So people aren't really coming on the boats anymore. They're still walking into the country. In 2025 alone, Cubans were the third largest asylum-seeking group globally. This new Cuban diaspora is often younger. Younger people are coming into the country, and they're arriving with a totally different social perspective than the people from what they called the Golden Exile generation of the 1960s. So we talked about a couple different things here, and we have a very famous Cuban American identifying politician who very proudly speaks Spanish on television and normalizes his generational status and might reflect a heartbeat of America. So let's take Un Espejo de Marco Rubio. When we talk about the Cuban American experience, we often look at figures like Marco Rubio. His story is a masterclass in the complexity of la mezcla. So Marco Rubio se nació en Miami in 1971. His parents are Cuban, and they immigrated to the United States in 1956, before the Castro Revolution. So Marco Rubio grew up in the tension between two worlds, los dos mundos, de Cuba y de los Estados Unidos. El abuelo de Marco se llama Pedro Victor García. Fue deportada porque no tiene papeles. Ella fue undocumented immigrant antes de las derechas for parolee status. Marco Rubio represents the bridge generation. Fue un hijo de los 70s who saw his parents work as bartenders and housekeepers. La mamá de Marco Rubio fue una limpiadora. Es una historia muy common con el gente latinos en los Estados Unidos. But he rose to the Senate. He got his education, and his journey reminds us that la mezcla gente isn't just about balancing ethnicities. It's balancing and rewriting the narrative of their ancestors, the refugee, the economic migrant, and the American dreamer, all inside una corazón. Este es nuestro mundo. And Marco Rubio, every time I see him on TV, it doesn't matter what his political views are. Every time I see him speak Spanish on national television, I feel my heart beat just a little bit stronger por mis amigos y mis vecinos. Because even though we talked about a couple weeks ago, Spanish is technically la segunda idioma en este país, when he speaks it on the national stage and then he makes a joke and doesn't translate it, and only the people who speak Spanish understand what he said, I just feel a part of a very warm community of Latino culture here. And I'm just so proud that he, as a first generation American, is paving the way for other people, especially these dreamers in my generation, to be successful and to help continue to make our La Mezcla Gente en Este País the reality. So talking about that, how do we nurture their future? Marco Rubio's on TV all the time. My friends are making babies all the time. How do we support the mixed kiddos coming into our world? And how do we support mixed marriages? So as a community, it might be important to consider validating, neither, nor. Maybe pause for a moment. Pregunta despacio. Instead of what are you, start asking what's your story? And then also there's a grace with language. Nurturing Spanglish as a valid dialect of love rather than a failure of fluency. When I'm out and about, especially when I'm traveling to Chicago to visit family, oftentimes many of the workers that I pass by through the airport or on the train, however I'm getting to Chicago, I might ask them a question, and it's obvious that they don't really want to talk to me because they don't think I speak Spanish. So sometimes I'll pivot and I'll start speaking Spanish, and every time I get the warmest welcome to speak Spanish, which is interesting because sometimes I speak some other languages as well, not as well as Spanish, and certainly not as well as English. But when I speak Spanish to someone who's native Spanish speaking, all I feel is gratitude. And then third, to think about when nurturing our uprising generation is the community rituals. It might be important for us to create spaces where mixed families don't have to choose a side, where, we're nurturing and accepting people's stories than asking them how they identify. So to be mixed is a bridge, to be a bridge. And bridges are the only things that allow us to cross over into a new understanding of what it means to be human. So as you think about this next week, and maybe you see on the social media some different people with different views about immigration, and maybe some things contradict, but maybe some things have some clarity after this third episode about La Mezcla Gente. We'll see if I can continue this conversation next week. I would love any feedback from any viewers and any offers to be part of the conversation on La Mezcla Gente en el próximo semana. Otra vez, Carlos Sánchez está aquí en nuestro país. Carlos está visitando de la Dominicana. Y hay una comedy show a las 7 de mayo, este jueves a las 7 del noche at Laugh Camp Comedy Club. Estará un buen tiempo con bebidas y con comunidad y chistes, muchos chistes. Carlos is hysterical. If you didn't see the interview he had with another host on the podcast here, definitely watch it before you go to the show. He is a hoot. Muchísimas gracias por tu tiempo esta semana y hasta luego.